give you just a little bit of background. Why am I here doing this? My publisher, I'm an academic by training and a former university president. I've been president of 3 Catholic universities in Canada and vice president of a large Catholic university in Connecticut. So I've been in higher education for a very long period of time, but I also write books, and I've written about 20 of them, some co-authored, most have single-authored. The most recent one before was not the most recent, the diary is this one, the biography of Pope Francis, called The Jesuit Disruptor. And for many years, I've been the Vatican Affairs analyst for the Globe and Mail. Now, you know the Globe and Mail is a Toronto paper. It struggles to be the Winnipeg Free Press, but it remains the Globe and Mail, stuck at the center of Toronto life. And I've worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for many years as a writer and a narrator, so I've covered for the CTV network under papal commentator. So when a pope dies and a pope gets elected, they drag me into the studios, and I spend some time with the anchors who, for all intents and purposes, run the individual programs from Marcy McMillan to Satchigina. Now, the role here for writing this book is somewhat related to the experience acquired in these other iterations of my professional life, in the sense that I went to Rome to cover this synod for Paulus Press and for the Canadian correspondent, which is Novelis Bayard. And my job was to write a diary, not an analysis of synodality. Those kind of books will come later by theologians, church historians, and whatever. My job was, as an analyst, to be there, not as a delegate. There were synod delegates, bishops and lay people who represented Canada at the synod proper. They were in the synod hall, what we call the aula, and their job was to actually participate in the process of the synod itself. But then there was another class of people, the journalists, credentialed by the Stampa della Santa Sede, which is the press office of the Holy See, and our job was basically to cover the synod. Because when you're in the synod, you're not actually covering it, you're a participant in the process. So somebody who's covering it is one removed. You don't have the advantage, which is a wonderful advantage and privilege, to be actually in the hall, but you do have the obligation as a journalist to cover what happens in the hall, and the personalities, the people at play, the color, the dialogue, the intrigue, the battles, and everything that goes into a human drama, which is what happens in a synod in Rome. Now, it wasn't my first synod. My first synod was 1985. In 1985, Pope John Paul II called or convoked what was called the Extraordinary Synod. And the Extraordinary Synod was charged with the responsibility of assessing the 20 years of the Church since the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. A kind of, how are we doing? Okay, how's it going? And it was one of the more electrifying moments during the entire John Paul II pontificate. And I was there to cover the synod, and it was an unusual experience for me because I had not covered a synod before, and I discovered very quickly that covering a synod in 1985 was no easy task because nobody wanted to talk to you. So they had limited press conferences. It was an Episcopal synod only, which meant that only bishops could attend. It was in a different building. It was layered or tiered seating so that the bishops would give their interventione, their intervention would last for 7-8 minutes. Then they would sit down, the next bishop would pop up and give his. They were unrelated, nobody talked to each other. It was done in an enclave, quite removed from where the public was. There was maybe 1 or 2 occasions during the synod moment, or a couple of weeks that they had of the synod. It was usually, an extraordinary synod is usually 2 weeks, an ordinary synod is 3 to 3.5 weeks. They would allow you in as auditores, as people who could listen, see something in action. Well, that wasn't particularly satisfactory, and there was little evidence that many of the bishops seemed to have a pulse, because everybody seemed comatose, and you can understand why they would be. I had a lot of sympathy for the bishops. They sit there, they give their presentation, they don't engage because that's not the process. The Pope sits at the front with a number of curio cardinals, and he may or may not pay attention. When I was in there, he was reading his breviary. So the individual talks, but nobody reacts, nobody relates. They have a breakout section called the Circoli Minores, which are the small language-specific groups. So you'd have a Spanish group, a German group, a French group, an Italian group, an English group, and then if you didn't speak any of those languages, you were put in a Latin group. So you can imagine what that must have been like. You're from Singapore, or you're from, I don't know, Ghana or something, and you don't speak one of the major European languages, they say, well, okay, you're in the Latin group, right? So unless you're kept up in your Latin from your seminary days, you probably have no idea what's going on. So they would have these Circoli Minores, and they would have, somebody would write down various things, but they would redact them. So they take out all the juicy bits, all the really interesting things they took out, or they redacted. Then they would circulate them and say, okay, you can write a story about this. What, a story about what? It's vacuous. Well, there's nothing here. But that's the way it was done. So I went to 2 other synods, one that dealt with the priesthood, one that dealt with the laity. And they were pretty well exactly the same. When I got back, I remember specifically, this is a wonderful moment why I love Winnipeg, when I came back to the University of Toronto, St. Michael's, they asked me to give a public address on the laity synod. So I went to give it. There was actually a full hall, which was impressive. So I went, and sitting in the front row was the Cardinal Archbishop of Winnipeg, George Flaff. And I said to him, why are you sitting here? Prelates usually keep their distance from me. And I said, although I wrote a biography of a cardinal and a biography of a pope, I don't usually move in their orbit, and they tend to be cautious around journalists anyway. So I said, why are you here? He said, okay, well, Michael, you're a lay person. It was on the laity. You're a scholar, and I have something to learn. I said, well, that's unbelievable, Cardinal. Thank you. Because that's not usually the experience you have, okay? But it was very characteristic of Cardinal Flack, his style, his humility, his learning, and his wonderfully pastoral way. So Winnipeg was privileged in having him for the few years that he was here. Anyway, so when Francis came along, Benedict, by the way, modified the synod somewhat to make it more user-friendly. But he didn't change the synod substantively. Francis changed everything. Okay. So this synod that we had, the Synod on Synodality, was unlike any synod that I had attended as a journalist. But more importantly, it was unlike any synod that the bishops had attended. This time around, and I can tell you this, it's all a matter of record. It was covered. It was online, it was on air, tremendous media focus. The bishops who would come every day, we'd have at least one press conference. Sometimes we would have more than one if there was something extraordinary happened. So you were there for 30 days, and you have pretty well, 25 press conferences. By the time you go through most of the synod delegates, so you can see them up there, and they were very frank, very transparent, and spoke openly, because Francis had created that environment outside the aula. Inside the aula, inside the hall, there was custody of the tongue. He didn't want people talking outside the group of synod delegates. He wanted to preserve their privacy, and he wanted to make sure that they would speak frankly. He wanted parisia, the freedom of the spirit. He felt that if they were going to platform or hold their own private conferences or go out and meet with the journalists, they would eventually find themselves in a situation that was polarizing and combative. So they would come in and they would sit down and they would have opening remarks, and then they would respond to specific questions. Without a word of a lie, every single one of the bishops who was there, cardinal, archbishop, bishop, patriarch, whatever their rank, every one of them who had been a previous synod made it abundantly clear how free, liberated, and happy they were with this synod. One cardinal at the very beginning from Kinshasa said, you know, when I used to go to the synods before, when the plane landed on the tarmac in Rome, we knew everything had been discussed. The Pope had already decided what he was going to say. It didn't really matter if we were there. Okay? Now, this is extraordinary for several reasons. First of all, that a cardinal would say this. Okay? Would say it of dead popes, because it was the dead popes that largely ran how the synod operated. This pope changed all that. Okay? First of all, although synods are by their nature constitutionally episcopal, they are not exclusively episcopal. So he can add people who are outside the hierarchy to be part of the synodal process. And what he did was he appointed, or the various dioceses across the world sent synod delegates, lay people. I think there were somewhere in about 76, 77 lay people there, and of that, 50, I think, were women. This was extraordinary. Even more extraordinary, he gave them the right to vote. So when it came around the tables, when they were dealing with propositions, when they were preparing the final report, which I'll get to in a minute, when they were doing these things and they were voting, the planchet, non-planchet, the yes or the no, or the amendments or whatever, the lay people were equivalent to the bishop delegates who were sitting at the tables. Okay? Never been done before. Not in living memory anyway, certainly not in millennial memory. So the Pope had about 364 delegates in the 363, add him, it's 364 or whatever. And I remember at the end of the first session, because we had two sessions, one was in the fall of 2023, so the month of October, and then the following session in the fall, October of 2024. So there were two sessions, but there was a long preparatory phase that went beforehand, the phase in which we call the, when they respond to the lineamenta, the secretariat of the General Secretariat of the Synod in Rome sends out a kind of a program. This is what we're going to do, this is what we want, this is the information, this is the consultative phase. Went on for a long time because the Pope really wanted extensive consultation. Then you move to what is called the Laboris document, Laboris documentum or whatever, I've just forgotten the last word, but this document is the working document of the Synod. And we were presented with the document as well, the journalists, and we had information around the lineamenta, and we knew who the personalities were, and we were given the detailed description of all, not description, but names of all the delegates. So the press was as up to date as it could be, given the traditional Roman constraints, but way beyond what we had been accustomed to working with under previous popes. So Francis, at the end of every synod, you have the delegates present what are called the propositions, the propositiones. And those propositions go to the Pope. And the Pope then writes a document, a letter, well, sometimes an encyclical, but sometimes an apostolic exhortation, whatever genre identification, identifying how important it is in terms of the magisterium. And he does it, and he could do it within months, he would do it within a year before he produces the document. What does Francis do? The delegates gather, they produce the final report, he accepts it and says it's now part of the ordinary magisterium or the teaching of the church. I don't need to write anything about it. I accept what you have written because I was with you. Again, unprecedented. Never happened before. So the process of the Synod was unlike anything that we have seen in the Catholic Church. And although other churches have something called synods, the Anglican Church has a synod every 3 years. Synodal governance is a feature of the Lutheran Church, a very important constitutive component of the Orthodox churches. But in the Roman tradition, synods are rare, although the term can be used to talk about ecclesial assemblies. So in a way, the Second Vatican Council of 1962-65 was an episcopal synod because the people who were there were the bishops, and the periti, or the theological experts who were there, did not have voting rights. But Synod, as we understand it now, is really a recreation or a reintroduction in the life of the Church by Pope Paul VI in the late 1960s. It was Pope Paul that brought the Synod back as a level of governance and consultation within the Church. And there were great debates as to whether the Synod should be legislative and deliberative or just simply advisory and consultative. And those debates have gone on for quite a while. But clearly in this case, Pope Francis wanted to move it forward. He wanted the synodal experience to be something that would become a template, become a model for the universal Church. When the first session ended in October of 2023, we were coming out of the Basilica, and I was walking with Tom Rees. Tom Rees is an American Jesuit. He had been editor of American Magazine in New York. And we were walking out, and I said to him, okay, well, now it's been an exciting time for the delegates. There's no question that even those who were critical, skeptical, cynical, were, with very rare exceptions, maybe one or two, completely converted to the process. And they were very public about that. I said, now, what happens to the other 1.4 billion Catholics out there? How do we communicate this? I mean, what's going to happen to the rest of them? And he said, look, I'm a political scientist by training. And I can tell you right now, in the end, everything depends on leadership. Everything depends on leadership. And this is why many of the synodal fathers and synodal mothers and all those who were attendant at the synod were apprehensive when Francis died. Because will the new pope carry forward the insights, the energy, the commitment to synodality, which I believe to be Francis's greatest project? Well, we didn't need to worry too much, because Pope Leo, from the moment he appeared on the Loggia, Apostolic Loggia, to be introduced to the world, and ever since has made it clear that synodality is an important pastoral strategy, an important pastoral concept that will be implemented in the Church. And Pope Francis's decree, or instruction, indicating that we have 3 years for the implementation phase, Leo confirmed that to be true. He strengthened the General Secretariat of the Synod, made sure that Cardinal Horlick, Cardinal Grech, Sister Paquette, Nathalie Paquette, and the others are going to continue to be important figures in the life of the Synod in Rome and making these things happen. Now, it's easy to say that, but it is difficult on the ground. Okay, and maybe some of these things can come up during our conversation here. I wanted, just as a preliminary way, as a prelude, just to give you some background as to what happened during those years, why I was there, and what I was responsible for doing. My job was to cover the Synod. My job was not to be a voting delegate of the Synod, did not have that authority, and so I was there as a journalist and as an analyst. The next phase we're going to be moving into is the implementation phase, and we're in it already. And there are various pockets of the universal Church where synodality has been enthusiastically embraced, and there are large sections of the Church where that is in fact not the case. But Pope Leo is not giving up on this. And there'll be reports that will be made by national conferences of bishops and whatnot to keep things up to date. And I'd be happy to talk about other aspects of synodality and some of the characters involved in this process, because I think it's really quite exciting. I'll just end by saying this. So when Paulus Press said, well, what kind of book should we write? I said, well, why don't we do a diary? Because a diary will capture something about the color and the personalities and the debates and whatnot, but it will be available to ordinary lay people, because commentaries on the theological concept of synodality, as valuable as they are, and they are more substantive and more for the researcher than they are for the average Catholic. So this is kind of an amuse-bouche. It gives you a taste of what the Synod was like and some of the players and whatnot, and hopefully won't contribute to what we are finding in some circles, in the United States at least, of Synod fatigue. People say, well, we keep talking about the Synod. What does it mean? What's going to happen? How do we move forward? Well, you can't have all the answers to that question in one small diary, but what we hope it does is it gives you a taste of the process and why, in the end, it is actually a very exciting project. Now, and I said it was going to end before, but I really will end with this. I'll pass it over to John. I was talking to a deacon, a permanent deacon from Antwerp, and he said to me, he said, this was echoed by other delegates from the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the Benelux, Belgium. If we don't become a synodal church, the church would disappear in our country. We don't have, it's not an alternative. It's not like, oh, wouldn't that be an interesting track to take? We're diminishing. We're in crisis mode. There are all kinds of structural and discipline challenges. Synodality is our hope. And Francis recognized that. Now, different jurisdictions in different countries, what is true of in various countries in Africa, in East Asia, in Latin America, is not necessarily true in Europe, and certainly not true in the North American jurisdiction. So they vary. But the recognition that synodality is our grace, it's going to allow us to renew ourselves and to survive as a church. No country experienced that more deeply and profoundly than Ireland. Ireland's what they call the Irish Synodal Pathway, and the other things that they're doing in Ireland is extraordinary. Why? Because the sexual abuse crisis gutted the church in Ireland from 1989 onwards. Okay? Terrible. Terrible. Scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. So the Irish church fell in the public eye in Ireland. Synodality seen as a way of restoring that, not by going back to the old order, but by showing that Irish Catholicism still has that old, wonderful spirit that characterized so much of its missionary life in earlier generations. So that's just one example. Right? So synodality actually matters. How it matters in Canada? Well, that's why we're here to talk about it.
Thank you, Michael. It was my privilege to be in Rome in October 2024 with Michael to be part of those press conferences and part of the reporting about the Synod. As a Protestant, I came there with different questions, and I was privileged to be able to write about it in the Free Press. But to you, Michael, you mentioned Ireland, and you mentioned in your book, the subtitle is 60 Days That Shook the Church. How is it shaking the church in Canada, or is it shaking the church in Canada?
Yeah, that's right. There are more tremors than there are earthquakes. The title I took from John Reed's book called The 10 Days That Changed the World, It Shook the World, which we covered in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Okay, so it's designed to be particularly provocative. And I remember Jim Martin, the Jesuit, saying to me, well, Michael, it's not 60 days, it's like 60 centuries. I said, yeah, it will take 60 centuries, but you have to start with the tremors, right? You have to start with the beginning. And my sense is that the church wasn't shaken to its foundation by some huge cataclysm or anything like that. But what Francis did was introduce a new way of being church people, of thinking of the ecclesia, of the church in different ways, of living out our baptismal vows in ways that are unlike the past. Now, sometimes Pope Francis has been criticized, and unjustifiably, it seems to me. There are legitimate grounds for criticizing Francis, but one of the grounds that was used unfairly was that he wanted the church discontinuous from the past, cutting it off from its past. That's not true. It wasn't a matter of rewriting or distancing yourself from the past. It was a matter of responding to the spirit of the times and how the spirit works in contemporary culture, and how do we make the gospel a visible presence, a salvific, visible presence in the lives of everyone. So Francis' concept of synodality is drawn from his experience as a Jesuit, so there's an Ignatian component to it. His experience as a Latin American prelate, he was the primary drafter of a famous document that came from Salem, a conference in what is called Aparecida in Brazil, which was a marvelous document talking about the church again in the Latin American context. And he realized that the church learns by listening. It learns by receiving the wisdom of the community. It learns by broadening outside limited hierarchical authority. I mean, Francis said on several occasions that he wanted to invert the pyramid. So he said, in the traditional operation of the pyramid, he says, I'm at the top, I'm at the apex, but the Pope is the servant of God, so I should be at the bottom. And he didn't mean it just as a working metaphor that was going to unsettle people. He meant it because he felt that the only way that the church could maintain its credibility or recover its credibility in some jurisdictions was by being faithful to the witness of the gospel and to our baptismal vows as a communio, as a communion. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that in ways that differentiate role and function and different charisms and whatnot, and all those are legitimate? How do you do it in a way? Well, you do it by talking to each other. Okay? You bring together people who talk to each other. And they talk to each other in a way that is punctuated by reverence, silence, prayerfulness, and honest speaking. And that there are structures for doing that. And so he incorporated many of these structures that they had learned and create the synodal model, which is an iteration of these things. And what he did was have them sit around the table, because he realized that when you listen to the other person and reverence them as people, rather than as combatants, adversaries, the enemy, but you listen to them, and you listen to them in ways that allow you not to have your own language and presuppositions get in the way. So you would have kind of a round table conversation 3 times, in which facilitated by someone assigned with responsibility for making sure everything goes according to time and convention and requirement, so you don't go off on speechifying or propagandizing or attacking. You just simply listen. Then you would have prayer, move back to a circle again, usually 10 people. The Synod delegate tables had 10 people who were the delegates doing this, and then you would have 2 people, one a facilitator and one a redactor. And their job would be to make sure that the process unfolds rightly. And the biggest challenge, and I participated in a mock version of it in what we call the Waterloo Synod in Ontario, and I found it very difficult not to pontificate. So when it was my turn to talk, I love to talk, as you're getting ample evidence, and I didn't want to give it up. And if somebody disagreed with me, I wanted politely to know why, but that's not the game. That's not the process. The process isn't grandstanding or lecturing or pontificate. It's listening. And it's listening to the other in a way that allows you to perceive the limitations of your own knowledge. So it's a humbling process, actually. And if you're accustomed to sitting at a table and you have rank as an archbishop or a cardinal or a patriarch or whatever, and you're accustomed to being deferred to, this is tough stuff, okay? And as a professor, and we're not too unlike them, we're presumed to be the repositories of knowledge and authority, and so we don't like being assumed that we're on par with everybody else. So the synodal process is a humbling process. Right? So you're listening to somebody, you're not saying, well, listen, I have 3 degrees in this field and I can tell you this. No, that's not. Not expertise you're bringing. It's the voice. I think it's happening in pockets. I think we don't have the momentum. I know that the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops now has a working committee on synodality. I know 2 of the people who are on the committee. I don't know what their plan is. I think they're still working on it. I think, and this is my personal view, that the Canadian hierarchy, Catholic hierarchy, is different than the American hierarchy. And the American hierarchy, with outstanding exceptions, but the American hierarchy was not Francis-friendly. Cardinal Pierre, who is the nuncio, just recently replaced by Cardinal Cassia, Archbishop Cassia. Cardinal Pierre said to me one time when I was in the States, just recently, he's he was a Breton. And he said to me at one point, we was at dinner, I was vice president of the university, and he said to me, he said, can I, you're a Canadian? He said, yeah. I said, yes. And he says, I'm from Brittany, so can we speak in French? Because they won't know what we're talking about. And I said, well, we can, but my French is quite fractured, imperfect, and incomprehensible, but I think I'll be able to pick up your French. So what he said was, he said, this is a crazy country. It's a crazy country. And he said they don't like the Pope. He said the bishops don't like the Pope. He says, who's ever heard of anything like this? So I said, well, this was the very beginning of the end of the Obama government and the first year of the Trump administration. So it's Trump 1. And already he was picking up that this is a nightmare situation. And he would say, well, they don't like the Pope. What kind of a situation is this? So I said, yes, it's a strange place. Well, it's stranger now than it was then. And he's since been made a cardinal and was one of the Pope's closest allies, Francis, and also of Leo's. And he's replaced by Archbishop Cassia, who is just recently, has devoted to synodality as Cardinal Pierre. So the American hierarchy is in the process of some change. And the three, what are called residential cardinals, in other words, presiding as metropolitans over large sees, Chicago with Supich, McElroy in Washington, Tobin in Newark, are all extremely committed to synodality. They were all delegates at the synod, and they were personal friends of Francis, and they appear to be on very good terms with Pope Leo. So the American church is slowly changing. In Canada, we didn't have a history of resistance or hostility to Francis, but we didn't have a history of full embrace either. It's kind of a classic Canadian response. We do things so middle of the road that it's colorless and difficult to know where we're going. So you do have bishops across the country who are deeply invested in synodality, I can tell you that. But it's also been my experience that most of the bishops are just biding their time. I don't know whether it's inertia. It's not opposition to the Pope, by the way. It's not, like we do with synodality is going to be disruptive of Catholic life. It's a schismatic proposition. No, nothing like that. It's either exhaustion, inertia, waiting out the Pope. That was the argument for the longest time. We'll wait out the Pope. Well, they're going to have a long wait because the one we have in now is only 70, 71, and he's relatively healthy. And the way things have been working lately, popes go well into their late 80s. So Leo's going to be around for a long time, and so waiting out Leo isn't going to work as a strategy. Okay, so I think now what we need, and I've been putting some pressure on some figures anyway in the CCCB, is we need to get serious about this by doing some things. And one of the things we should do, and it seems to be abundantly clear that we must do, is explain what synodality is. I said the Catholic members of parishes, congregations, they don't hear it because the priests don't preach it. They don't preach it because they don't know themselves. Nobody's bothered to teach them. Now we've had a presbyteral group that went over. We have some priests who've been very active, many of them religious order priests who've been active in synodal discussions, but in a majority of cases, the parish priest has got lots of things on his plate. Increasingly, they run clustered parishes. They have several things they need to do as sacramental ministers. So dealing with synodality is not something on their horizon, and many of them don't keep up with the reading. With the paucity of Catholic publications in the last couple of decades, Compass, Grail, the Prairie Messenger, Western Catholic Reporter, Catholic New Times, the New Times of Montreal have all disappeared, and none of them have been replaced. So if you have only BC Catholic, the Catholic Register, and the New Freeman, and occasionally Island Catholic, these are the only organs, Catholic organs of transmission and information you have. And if they're not in your parishes, or you don't subscribe to them, or you're not a member, you don't participate in Salt Life, which is our television equivalent, you're going to be left out in the cold. And unless the priests are reading the documents coming from Rome and coming from the Secretariat, and there's a very strong likelihood they're not, unless they have a synodal committee in their parish structure, parish council, it's ignorance. It's not hostility. But ignorance can really ground or exercise a grinding effect on the momentum. If people aren't committed to it, the momentum, which we believe is a momentum of the Spirit, will be frustrated. But they can't engage in the synodal process if they don't know what it is. So I'm in the process of suggesting, I don't know how far it's going to go as a suggestion, that one easy way to begin this is to produce a small booklet or pamphlet, or just something you turn over and it's just 2 pages, explaining what synodality is. And insert it in the parish bulletin and put it at the back of the parish so that we begin the process of communicating this information. Because if the only people we're talking to are people who are interested in the synod as a process, and they were always going to be a minority, okay, and the parish priests aren't brought up to speed, and the bishops are reluctant to get hugely involved because it's going to be an investment in time, labor, and energy, and they just don't have that, then this will sputter out. But the Pope doesn't want it to sputter out, and the Secretariat doesn't, and all the delegates don't. And there's every reason for it not to, because it's of the Spirit.
You mentioned a 3-year implementation plan. As of what date does it begin, or did it begin?
It began.
Started.
Yeah, I know it started, but
So
what is
we're about 3 to 6 months into it.
into it? Okay.
I have a comment and then a question. My comment is, and this may be news for everybody here, but the Leadership Conference of Women Religious was, a couple of years ago, was approached by Porticus, which is a big funding organization, international, to say they believed that if the Synod was going to take root in the Church, that it would have to be moved forward, not exclusively, but by women religious, religious period. And they made that observation just because that's what had brought the Catholic, the Vatican II, into the parishes. That the pioneers were the religious of the Church. So that's available. It's 6, the LCWR put together 6 modules that is an educational thing that's free for download at the LC Leadership Conference of Women Religious website. That's the comment. The question is, it keeps being a question for me, what is really the source of the indifference or the resistance to the Synod? Like it just hasn't caught hold in most dioceses.
I'll respond to the first one. Thank you for talking about women religious, because the union of women general superiors in Rome was extremely important for the Synod. And the representative women, the sisters who were there, were among the very best Synod delegates. Not infrequently, they were the best educated. They were strong advocates. They knew what they were talking about. And it's not surprising that Pope Francis not only valued them, he began the process of appointing them, which Leo has done as well, into very senior positions in Vatican governance. The head of the governorate, which is the body that actually governs the Vatican City State, is a woman, is a nun. Unheard of. Okay? Women have prominent positions in dicasteries, or the departments or congregations of the Vatican that govern the Church, which they never had before. So they're in that governance structure as well. These are all to the good. With regard to the second question, I think it's one that I've puzzled over, or rather the question of the comment, I've puzzled over. I think in part it's due again to ignorance more than anything else. It's not hostility. I think many people don't know what it means. Or they think it's a version of, remember there was a time in various structures, schools, hospitals, corporations, where you went into these strategic planning sessions that would go on for months and months and months, and there would be reports and great conversation and everything else, and in the end there would be a document produced, a mission statement that nobody really believed in because it was now so watered down it was useless. But the experience of being together was important, and lots of things were learned in that process. I think many people look at the Synod as something similar. So you bring people together, bring lay people together, they get to talk and everything else, but they don't have any power anyway, so what's the point? And at the end of it, it's kind of a human resources strategy, rather than a theological enlivening of the spirit and of the structure. So if it's that, if it's just a bunch of lay people getting around making your life difficult as a pastor or as a bishop, because they start asking questions, they want to have shared co-responsibility and shared governance and whatnot, then you're not going to be enthusiastic about this. You're going to say, oh God, just another layer of these things I have to deal with, right? But if you look at it as a very rich opportunity that will free you up from various and other tasks, enliven and deepen your own presbyteral experience as a priest or episcopal experience as a bishop. In other words, an ally, not an enemy, not an obstacle, but an ally. I remember, and I used this example, this was pre-synodal, wonderful priest by the name of John Barron. And he was, the bishop found him difficult to work with. He was the bishop of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so they decided to send him to a parish that they were convinced was disappearing. It was an old Italian parish in Bridgeport, an old Polish parish in Bridgeport, ethnic parish, and they thought, well, it's just petering out, we'll send him down there. Polish Franciscans, I think. He was a diocesan priest. He went in. Not only did he reverse the process of dying out, he enlivened the parish. He made the parish a model of parish life in the entire diocese of Bridgeport, which is a fairly large diocese in Connecticut. And he restored life to the place so that not only was there not just one Mass, there were 4 Masses with 4 separate choirs with an enormous outreach, and the parish flourished, and they had to hire, Interby hired a woman with a doctorate in theology who would be his consultant and executive assistant working in the parish. You know this kind of thing, right? And I remember one time going to hear him preach in the parish. His homilies were famous, wonderful. And I said, how is it in all this work that you have to do, you find the time to so carefully reflect on the scriptures and craft a homily of consistently high quality? And he said, well, first of all, because many of the lay people do so much of the other work. They enable me and free me up to be able to reflect and pray on this. He said, the other thing is when I get up there in the pulpit, Michael, and I look over the parish, I have 3 biblical scholars from Fairfield University, Sacred Heart University, Fordham University, 2 historical theologians, a systematic theologian. He said, yeah, what do I do with that? They're either the enemy, right? How am I going to do? Or they're my friends. And so if I'm wrestling over a passage of the book of Micah, I phone one of them and say, what do you think this means? So in other words, I see them as a resource. Okay, so they're there to help me be a better pastor and be able to construct better homilies. Now, isn't that wonderful? Wonderful example of humility, wonderful example of enabling in the parish. This is all pre-synodal. He died quite young. He had MS, and he died about the age of 59 or 60. A colleague and I dedicated one of our books on the priesthood of Henry Nouwen, Henry Nouwen's understanding of priesthood. We dedicated it to John Barron's memory. And I remember at the time, they couldn't find anybody to replace him. So the Jesuits would come in from Fairfield University and provide sacramental ministry on occasion. But the actual running of the parish was, what were they going to do? They couldn't close it down, they wouldn't. And so the bishop didn't know what to do. The bishop, they went to him and they said, well, you know, they have this marvelous woman, theologian, who worked with John. Why can't she run the parish? He said, oh no, we can't do that. And they said, well, then we'll leave. And so the bishop changed his mind, and she ran the parish. Not as a priest, she wasn't a presbyter. She didn't even presume to ordination, didn't want it. But what she did was to run the parish, bring people in, make sure that the vision that John Barron had continued. And the bishop bought into it. Why? Because it worked. Because he could see the consequences and the fruits of the Spirit. That's why. And that's why when you talk about the Synod, when you see it work, then you think, well, why the heck were we apprehensive about this? I talked to Sister Nathalie Picard, who is one of the great figures in synodal governance. She's a French nun, fairly young, early 50s, I think. She was a primary driver in the Synod, still is, the most senior woman member of the Secretariat. And I said to her, the last time I said we had coffee and interview in Rome, and I said, are you dispirited by this? She said, oh no. She said, we knew there would be all kinds of resistance, and the resistance sometimes would just simply be inertia, human like structural fatigue or whatever, still want to do this. She said, but when I go out and I travel all over the world and I go to spots in Africa and Sri Lanka and India and Kerala and I go to various places in Latin America and I see synodal parishes and I see what synodality means on the ground, you know Francis was right. And he said, so from our perspective, we're full of hope. I said, but the troopers in other jurisdictions, they don't have this vantage point. And that comes back again to communication. How do we tell and communicate to people how wonderfully liberating the synodality is? It's not a theological neologism or archaism or a theological concept of limited and trendy evanescence. It's a new way of thinking as a church, which will enliven and deepen our experience as Christians. That's what Francis believed. That's what the Synod delegates believed. And I think, John, you were there as a Protestant observing the scene. I think you would agree that the excitement in Rome was electric. Now, how do we get it from Rome to all the other arteries all over the place on the planet where Catholic life is? That's what we need to do. That's our challenge. And somebody we did a recent webinar, and my interlocutor is a woman theologian who's doing her doctorate on synodality at Regis College at the University of Toronto. And she was arguing, she said, Michael, you go on and on about the leadership thing, but the leadership's going to come from the laity. And I say, yeah, yes and no. The leadership, the traction, the energy and the momentum will be driven by the laity. But the episcopate and the presbyterate have to provide the context and initial leadership. Can't be done separately, can't be done in part. You can't say, okay, this is a lay thing, we don't really need to worry about it. Or this is an episcopal synod, only the bishops get together. No, Francis broke through that. I'll just conclude by this one comment. One of the things that bothers me about people who are indifferent to the Synod, or maybe not indifferent so much, but actually resistant to the Synod, and there are people around who are, some bishops, and they're fairly prominent, not so much in Canada, is the fact that these are the same people that get ecstatic over the declaration that John Henry Newman is now not only sainted, but a doctor of the Church. Well, what part of Newman do they not get? Newman wrote about the development of doctrine. Newman was the first major figure to identify the importance of the laity in the life of the Church. He wrote a famous work in 1859, the same year as Darwin published The Origin of Species, in which he talked about the laity as essential to the life of the Church, and he gave 5 instances when the laity saved the Church. Okay. So this same guy that they now go all romantic about, they don't seem to know the history here. And I said to one of them, I said, okay, I've taught Cardinal Newman in graduate courses and undergraduate courses and whatnot, and I've written a book on him called The Laity of the Church. the wisdom of John Henry Newman. So I was mentored by one of the great Newman scholars of the world, James Monroe Cameron. So I've got Newman in my blood. So to me, it's a huge puzzle that people are saying, oh, yes, isn't it? What have we got? St. John Henry Newman. I said, okay, St. John Henry Newman. Good point. I said, he became a Roman Catholic in 1845. And from 1845 to 1878, when Leo XIII, at his first consistory, created him a cardinal, he lived under the shadow of Rome's displeasure and censure. In other words, the very church he converted to persecuted him for the majority of his life. And then suddenly, oh, wait a minute, we got that one wrong. But no public recognition of this. No humbling of the institution, saying, you know, it's amazing what Newman gave us, and we persecuted the guy for all these decades, and yet he stayed firm within the church. There's a famous line by the French Dominican Henri Clédessac, who said to Jacques Maritain, he said, you know, it's very difficult to suffer persecution in the name of the church. It is more difficult to suffer persecution at the hands of the church. Newman is a perfect example of that. So now we've sainted him, we've made him a doctor of the church with highest honor we can give him. Now it's time to take him seriously. And if we take him seriously, synodality will be an outcropping of his wisdom. I think Francis clued into that. I mean, patience is essential. Understanding that people, again, are not hostile or resistant, but they're just uninformed. And if you inform them, and you take the time to inform them in a respectful way, then they'll get on side. And that's labor intensive. And I think that that's why some in the church are reluctant to follow this process beyond a superficial way, because they realize you're going to have to make a commitment that's going to be a while, right? I was struck a couple of times in the last year, and it was unrelated to synodality. I was invited to a couple of parishes, one in Etobicoke, Ontario, and one in Brampton, in the Archdiocese of Toronto. And I went, and one of them, they wanted me to come to speak about the relationship of Pope Francis to Thomas Merton, because I had written an article on Merton and Francis, and Pope Francis had a great love for Merton. And you may remember that when he came to the United States to speak to the House of Congress, combined Houses of Congress, he identified 4 moral prophets in the United States, and they were Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton was the most revolutionary thing you could say, because many American bishops had taken Merton out of their catechism because they found him unorthodox. The Pope comes along, and now they have to, and names him as one of the great moral prophets in U.S. history, and so they had to put him back in the catechism. I'm not sure how they did that. It was not so much a catechism, it was a high school textbook. I should be clear about that. But so I went to give this talk on Merton and Pope Francis. But really, during the questions, it wasn't about Pope Francis and Thomas Merton. It was about this thing called synodality they had heard about. They said, what is this? Why is it showing up? We don't know anything about this. Now, the parish hall was packed, absolutely packed. To be about 1.5 size here, packed, and the parish priests were there, and everybody was interested and whatnot. And I thought, now isn't this extraordinary? People are catching on that there's something going on in the Catholic Church, but they can't figure out what it is, and they don't know where to go to get clarity. And the parish priests were there taking down notes because they're trying to figure out what to do. And then you realize that part of this is, again, communications, right? It comes down to communications. Who is communicating? How do we do it? How comprehensive are we? And that's why I wanted to, and I did, suggest to one of the people on the committee who's going to take it to the CCCP committee, that one of the really practical way of doing this is just to produce a pamphlet that gives the definition. You were talking about synodality, synodos from the Greek, walking together, but they don't know that. So give them the definition. Help them understand this. People aren't stupid. Don't dump things down, okay? Don't offend them, okay? Treat them properly, but respectfully. They'll grasp it. It's not nuclear physics. They'll figure it out, and how it applies to their life in the parish, okay? But you have to give them the information. And I think that that's the stage we're at now. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I'm not trying to push the book here, it's not a marketing moment, but it was one of the reasons, I think, why Novalis decided to go along with as a co-publisher for the book, to get something out there This is not exhaustive, it's not complete, it's not comprehensive. It is, as I said, an amuse-bouche, but it's the beginning. And we all have to start somewhere. And what better place than to start at the beginning, right?
I wonder if you could comment about the reaction of the Synod amongst the German bishops. Seems to have created an impact, and it's the only country I've heard about where this seems to have happened. And I was wondering how many were on one side, how many on the other. You know better than I can. Just give some clarity to that.
That was the most fiery thing at the Synod. Are the Germans going a different way from the rest of the church? And the Germans were attacked quite relentlessly, actually, by various individuals who said, it was a criticism that goes back to an earlier critique of the Second Vatican Council, where people who resisted the Second Vatican Council talked about the Rhine flowing into the Tiber, that the Germans had taken over the church. And if you look at the great names like Cardinal Rahner and Ratzinger himself, of course, and Hugo Rahner and Metz, so many of them were German theologians and thinkers, right? So that criticism arose here, which was very interesting that it would be revived as a conspiracy theory. Of course, we live in an age of conspiracy theories, so it came out that the Germans, again, are doing things differently than the rest of us. Well, the Germans were doing, yes, they were doing some things differently because the momentum was different and because the commitment was different. The German bishops made it very clear, they were the best, in my view. They were the most frank, they were the most direct, the most articulate bishop delegates at the Synod. Because when they were there was no sugarcoating, there was no justification, no apologizing, frank speaking. And the German bishops made it very clear that if we do not buy into synodality in the way that we have been talking about, there will not be a German Catholic Church. And we're where we are now because of the sex abuse crisis. That's why we are. Hundreds of thousands of Catholics every year withdraw from membership in the church. This matters in Germany and in Luxembourg and in Austria, not sure about Switzerland, where membership in the church by baptism means transfer of government monies to the maintenance of the church. So millions and millions of euros are lost on an annual basis because Catholics take their names off the registry. Okay? So from a basic point of view of how do you maintain the structures, the universities, the hospitals, and Misericordiae, which was the major, like their Caritas or the Canadian Development and Peace, the great Catholic charity, was second in the world. Second in the world. The amount of money coming from the German church to countries desperately in need of resources was coming from the German Catholic Church. And one of the reasons was the monies that would be transferred by the state because somewhere a little over a third of Germany is Catholic. Okay? The sex abuse crisis shattered everything. Everything. Crisis in Cologne, crisis in Stuttgart, crisis in Regensburg, where Ratzinger had been a professor, crisis in Munich. So you have all these things going on, and the Germans had always had this wonderful tradition of the Katholentag. I don't think my German is correct, but it's an occasional gathering of lay people in the Catholic Church, and they gather, and a huge number show up. It's a big kind of part festival, part conference, part symposium, part synod, and they debate things and whatnot. And it would be a Lutheran or non-Catholic equivalent, and sometimes they would work in conjunction. And then synodality took off. Like, how are we going to hold the bishops accountable for what happened? How are we going to change the church so we're not faced with this kind of crisis and pathology? How do we address this? So the bishops, the vast majority of the hierarchy, are completely committed to a German scouring of the landscape. And synodality was the way to do this. Well, Rome was frightened by this. this is bringing synodality to a level that they don't want. They don't want it to be legislative. They don't want lay people sitting down with the German bishops making decisions about discipline, maybe having married priests, maybe moving doctrinally to the ordination of women to the diaconate. They don't want this. Okay? So Rome was very apprehensive about this. The German bishops, several of them, went down, had several meetings with the Vatican authorities, and satisfied the Vatican authorities. Rome was satisfied with this. Rome did not crush the German Synod. There's this perception that they crushed the Synod. They didn't. They were anxious that the Germans were going further than anybody else, and they didn't want that to be the template, because they feared that the German experience would not be replicated in other jurisdictions outside. Like, that's not what the church is going to in Angola or Namibia. It's not the same thing. So there was an effort to try to contextualize the German synodal experience, in part replicated in Ireland. And just this week, so it's an extremely pertinent question, the German bishops confirmed the establishment legislatively of a German synod, operating German synod governance model. And they're in the process of now getting Rome's final approval, so there'll be German bishops who will go down to Rome, talk with Leo, and say how we're going to move forward with this. So the German bishops, when they spoke in Rome, didn't attack the general arguments around synodality and governance. What they were saying was, look, we're German bishops. We're German shepherds. Our job is to listen to our people. Our people live in anguish. We are in crisis mode, and we need to respond. And to do so in a superficial way will kill the church. This, by the way, was an experience, as I mentioned earlier, that was also echoed in Belgium, in the Benelux, in the Netherlands, right? And again, it's reflective of church experience and structure and crisis. And I'll just end by saying this, because it was one of the real joys of the Synod experience for me. I lived with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate in their generalate on the Via Aurelia, and it's a big place. I mean, it would belong to the Pacelli family, where Pope Pius XII came from. It was their summer villa. And it's a gorgeous place, and they have hundreds of oblate seminarians and student priests from all over the world, mostly from Africa and Asia, and they're all there, and they're learning Italian, and they were surprisingly and refreshingly eager people. I had caricatured them wrongly. Caricature is wrong, but I had especially got it wrong. And then they would ask me to talk about synodality with them, which I did on several occasions. And they bought into it completely. Of course, they're in Rome, right? But one of the bishops who was there from the Archbishop, and he's from Namibia, and we got on wonderfully well because we're shaped in the same way. We're kind of rotund and short and lively and whatever, so we would always be laughing all the time. And I said to him, so what's the big issue with the Namibian bishops? Like, we know what's going on with the Germans. He said, oh yeah, we have our big issue is polygamy. Okay? We don't have any of these other things. Our big issue is, and it's a big issue. So he said, we go to the Pope, we go to Francis, and he says, okay, so what are you going to do about the polygamy? And they said, oh yeah, well, we have to find a pastoral solution because you got people in the parish, and we got one father and 3 wives and several generations of kids, and it really upsets our sacramental system. What are we going to do about this? And he said, Francis says, well, you're the experts, and it's your pastoral context. You write up what needs to be done, and you bring it to me. Not, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you go back and you implement that in the diocese. No. See, that's the synodal way of governance. I want to end, I keep saying I'm going to end, but I want to end here with what Pope Leo's done. You may be aware that in January of this year, he held what was called an extraordinary consistory. Now, consistories are when you gather cardinals together, and you usually create them. Interesting use of language, right? Cardinals are not appointed, they're not elevated, they're created. That's why you can have That's why you can have lay people and you can have lay women as cardinals. Because it's not an order, it's not a rank of ministry. So Leo calls all the cardinals of the world, all of them. I don't know, 200 some whatever, including the ones who are 80 plus, right? You can't vote, but they're still cardinals. So he brings the majority, not all of them can make, brings the majority together. What did they do? He listens to them. What he was modeling was synodality at his level. He said, now bring the cardinals together, and we need to work, because it's our church, and we're going to work together. Okay, so he listens to them. Okay? Now that's a model that he's sending out to the bishops of the world. Do this. Do this in your diocese, what I'm doing in the Church Universal with the College of Cardinals, who are my advisors. Bring them together. Bring your priests and lay people together. And listen. Don't judge. Listen. All right? And I think that's the key thing where we are with synodality right now. It's the creation of a culture of respectful listening. Cardinal Radcliffe, Timothy Radcliffe, the famous Dominican spiritual writer and theologian from Blackfriars, Oxford, who was created a cardinal after the last synod, and I think Francis missed a great opportunity by not creating Sister Angelina, Mother Angelina, a cardinal. Yep. The two of them were the spiritual architects of the synod. But he named only the man a cardinal. He could have created her a cardinal. It would have been an unbelievable precedent, but it wouldn't have required synodal or conciliar approval because it's not a matter of order. It's not a matter of ministry. Cardinals are advisors to the Pope. So he didn't do it for whatever reason. But Radcliffe's presence there. Oh no, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It wasn't Radcliffe, it was Cardinal Schönborn, who's a Dominican, like Radcliffe, and a good friend of Radcliffe's. He's the former Archbishop of Vienna. And he said, there's this, I don't know whether he was a professor from Cambridge or whatever, a political scientist, a political theorist of some sort, and connected to the UN. And he went to Schönborn and he said, if we did at the UN what you are doing here in the Vatican as a model of synodality, we'd have no wars. Okay? I think there's a great element of truth to that. And it could be a gift of the Church to the larger world. But one of the things Francis wanted to do is not make discussion of synodality an in-house and ad intra affair, just Catholics talking to Catholics about how to improve the Church. Yeah, that's priority. But we have an ad extra responsibility to the world at large. And what Cardinal Schönborn was saying at the Synod was, well, this guy from the UN, he may have a point here. The way we listen respectfully to each other around the table without fighting can be a model that we could use for geopolitical reasons. Is it ambitious and likely? Probably not. Is it idealistic? Certainly. But then so is the gospel.
African delegates talking to European delegates said, maybe we'll support you on LGBTQ questions and on women's issues if you will support us on the question of polygamy, which is a really, beyond sitting at a table with 10 people, it's the whole church starting to listen reverentially to each other. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can. This is probably a good way to wrap it up. Yes, it's a good question. I think and this would happen at the Second Vatican Council as well. It happened at other synods. And that is conversations outside the aula, outside the wall, right? When people get together, bishops get together, paridi or theological experts get together, they talk, they strategize, they meet, they say, if we get support on this, will you give us support on this particular topic and whatnot? And some people are scandalized by that. They think that that reeks of democracy or parliament or business or something. No, it doesn't. It's human activity, and that's how the Spirit operates in the Church, right? The political reality of the Vatican is sometimes a shock to Catholics. It shouldn't be. That's the way it works. It works. We work within our structures, right? So the awareness that we have, the pastoral awareness we have in terms of the priorities of a particular jurisdiction, LGBTQ matters greatly in North America. It doesn't matter hugely in Africa. So the Church of North America needs to teach the Church in Africa a way of being more accepting of an alternate anthropological model. At the same time, the Church in North America needs to hear African experience, what it is that is at the core of African life. And of course, when you say that, you have to already distinguish or differentiate. Because we do this often enough, right, in our culture. We talk about Africa. Well, there are numerous countries in Africa, and Ghana doesn't do what South Africa does, and South Africa doesn't do what Nigeria does. So we have to be really careful about making sure we do, and same with North America. So when people say, oh yes, it's a North American obsession, well, it may be more an American than it is Canadian, and it may not even have an impact in Mexico. Mexico is part of North America. The Mexican church has very different priorities. So the thing that I think what Francis wanted with Synodality, by bringing all these people together, different genders, different backgrounds, different charisms in the church, around the table, got to remember how again, starkly novel this is. When I was in Rome for the early synods, I was telling you, it was tiered. It was like an amphitheater, right? So the Pope was at the bottom with some of his assistants right there, and it went from tier to tier to tier up. And of course, at the very top, at the back, where nobody could see us, were the lay peoples, right? And we were brought in just for an occasional visit. What Francis does is he changes the whole model. So they're sitting at tables like we are now, okay? There's no hierarchy. So the Cardinal Archbishop of, Baghdad, who's a patriarch, is sitting beside a woman delegate from Omaha, right? That's new. That has not happened before. So she learned something about Baghdad, and he learned something about American experience in Omaha. Now, what's wrong with that? Nothing is wrong with that. You know, when my wife and I are here in Winnipeg, we've taken to going to St. Mary's Cathedral for Sunday Mass. And one of the reasons why we love it is its rich multi-ethnic composition. And it's wonderfully progressive, but deeply respectful, often devotional, and wonderfully accomplished music and liturgy. It's connected to its people. And I'm sure many other parishes are similarly like that. Are there discussions going on about synodality? I don't know, and I've had a chance to ask the rector. I'd like to at some point. But in one way, that parish lives synodality. See, in some respects, there are wonderful models of synodality. We just don't call it that, right? So, but by talking about synodality as a universal pastoral strategy of mission and communion, which is the technical language of the synod, what we're attempting to do is to bring that kind of model to the universal church. Okay? And given the many crises we face on the planet right now, it's never been more urgent. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm sure we should wrap up at this point. I'm sorry, but you can come forward and talk to Michael and buy his book.
Talk to anybody.
Please.
Just buy the book.
He said Mark read this book. So please, yes, let's wrap it up now because I think we've taken this much.